At 99 years old, Mel Brooks has reached a vantage point that few in the history of entertainment ever touch. He is no longer just a filmmaker or a comedian. He is a living archive of the golden age of Hollywood, and a man who has outlived his contemporaries and his rivals alike. For decades, Brooks maintained a level of professional diplomacy that allowed him to navigate the shark-infested waters of the studio system while keeping his private grievances behind the curtain. But as he nears a full century of life, the filter has finally dropped. The legendary mind behind masterpieces like Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein has begun to share the truth about the figures who disrupted his creative process and the actors he truly could not stand to work with. This is not a story of petty celebrity feuds or tabloid gossip, but rather a deep look into the rigid artistic philosophy of a man who viewed comedy as a sacred architecture. When Brooks reflects on his career, he does not just see a collection of hit movies. He sees a carefully constructed ecosystem. In his world, comedy was never about a single person standing in a spotlight. It was about a collective rhythm and an unselfish devotion to the story. To enter the Brooks universe, an actor needed more than just talent. They needed humility and the willingness to serve the script. Over the years, several of the biggest names in the industry, including Jerry Lewis and Chevy Chase, found themselves on the outside looking in. While the world saw them as comic geniuses, Brooks saw them as agents of chaos who threatened the very foundations of his work. The names on this list might surprise you. Some were lifelong friends like Gene Wilder, whose professional separation left a lingering ache in the heart of the comedy king. Others were titans of the stage like Frank Langella, or television icons like Harvey Corman, who discovered that brilliance does not always translate into a smooth partnership. In this investigative report, we are peeling back the layers of these 5 specific relationships to understand why even the most legendary performers could be rejected by the master of comedy. We are exploring the moments when the rhythm was broken and the collaborations turned into duels. This is the definitive account of the actors Mel Brooks refused to let back into his world, and the high price of maintaining the sacred timing of a joke. To understand why Mel Brooks and Jerry Lewis could never coexist on a film set is to understand the difference between an architect and an explosion. Mel Brooks built comedy like a structural engineer, prioritizing the ensemble first, and ensuring that every rhythm and pause served the greater structure of the film. Jerry Lewis, on the other hand, was a force of nature, a virtuoso of absurdity who had spent decades perfecting a style of slapstick mayhem that made him a global phenomenon. While Brooks admired the mad genius of the man who influenced generations of comedians, that professional respect never evolved into a desire for a personal or professional partnership. To Brooks, Lewis was a man who didn't just want a spotlight, he wanted to be the sun around which the entire production orbited. The tension between these two titans finally reached a breaking point in the mid-1980s, during the early development stages of the film Life Stinks. The project was a sharp social satire focusing on a billionaire who finds himself forced into a life of homelessness, and the studio executives saw a golden opportunity. They suggested that casting Jerry Lewis in a major supporting role would elevate the project's profile and add a layer of legendary comedic power. Brooks, however, shut the idea down without a moment's hesitation. His reasoning was blunt and revealed his deepest fears about the production's integrity. He told his producer that he didn't need someone on set who believed they were funnier than the film itself. Brooks was well aware of Lewis's notorious reputation for taking over every room he entered. Lewis had a well-documented habit of rewriting scenes in the middle of a take, arguing with directors over every minor syllable, and using his sheer force of personality to overwhelm his collaborators. For a director like Brooks, who thrived on a very specific brand of controlled madness, but refused to ever surrender his authority, such a partnership was a recipe for catastrophe. Brooks fiercely guarded his creative territory, whether he was in the editing room or on a soundstage, and he knew that Lewis's ego would eventually lead to a draining of the entire ensemble's energy. Their only attempt at finding common ground took place during a dinner arranged by a mutual acquaintance at a neutral location. Brooks arrived with an open mind, genuinely curious if there was a way to make their two worlds align. However, any hope for a collaboration vanished the moment Lewis swept into the room. Lewis arrived late and immediately launched into an exhaustive monologue about the future of American comedy, barely acknowledging Brooks as a potential partner. Brooks sat back and listened, choosing his words carefully, and eventually excused himself early from the table. There was no dramatic shouting match, just a quiet realization that their temperaments were fundamentally incompatible. Following that night, Brooks never again entertained the idea of working with Lewis. While the two maintained a thin veil of public civility, and Brooks never mocked him openly, the internal divide was absolute. Brooks later remarked to a friend that if someone sees themselves as the center of the universe, they cannot live in his. In the Brooks ecosystem, talent alone was never enough to guarantee entry. What mattered was the willingness to serve the story rather than dominate it. Jerry Lewis was a man who overflowed with ability, but he lacked the one trait Brooks demanded above all else: the capacity to play wholeheartedly and selflessly within the ensemble. For Mel Brooks, no professional wound cut deeper than the quiet unraveling of his bond with Gene Wilder, the man he once hailed as his artistic twin flame. Wilder wasn't simply another performer drifting through the Brooks universe. He was a co-conspirator in the very reinvention of American comedy. Together, they didn't just craft films, they detonated cultural expectations. From the audacious satire of The Producers to the lightning-in-a-bottle brilliance of Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, their partnership was a seismic event in cinema. Wilder brought a tremulous sincerity and an electrical tenderness that perfectly balanced Brooks's manic wildness, transforming what could have been mere chaos into something immortal. However, beneath the thunderous applause of their greatest successes, the ground between them began to shift. The friction started not with a lack of love, but with a growing divergence in their creative trajectories. After the grueling and meticulous work on Young Frankenstein, where Wilder had poured his soul into the script and performance, he felt he was ready to step out from under Brooks's shadow. Wilder approached Brooks with a new project he had written, The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother, fully expecting his mentor to shepherd it as a producer. But Brooks declined. It was a decision born from professional honesty rather than malice. Brooks later admitted he simply felt Gene wasn't ready to direct. But Wilder heard the reasoning as a painful rejection of their shared magic. He made the movie anyway, using the familiar faces of the Brooks regular cast. But the old alchemy was missing. What once felt effortless now felt forced, as if the constellation they had built together had finally scattered across the Hollywood sky. The years that followed were marked by a heavy, mutual silence, rather than public accusations. Brooks famously confided to a friend that watching Wilder walk away was like watching a brother pack his bags and leave home. Only he left carrying Brooks's best punchlines. While they would eventually encounter each other again by chance, the sacred loop of their collaboration had closed forever. Brooks, ever protective of his inner circle, never reopened the door for a second departure, leaving their golden era as a beautiful but fractured memory. In the end, Brooks was left inconsolable by the finality of their separation and Wilder's eventual passing, reflecting on a bond that was, at its height, nothing short of angelic. Through the 1980s and well into the early 90s, Chevy Chase was arguably the biggest comedic star in the world, and his name resurfaced repeatedly in conversations around Mel Brooks's projects. Studio executives, always hunting for marquee power, pushed hard for Chase to lead a Brooks film. On the surface, it made perfect sense. Chase was the master of the dry, razored humor that had defined the early years of Saturday Night Live and carried films like Fletch to massive success. Yet, every time the name was raised, Brooks dismissed the idea instantly. The reason was simple. Chevy Chase violated Brooks's most sacred unwritten rule of production. He was not a team player. Brooks had watched Chase's career unfold from a distance, noting a consistent pattern of behavior that felt toxic to the collaborative spirit of comedy. While Chase was undeniably quick and wickedly funny, he was equally capable of icing a room with a single smug remark or an arrogant lift of an eyebrow. To Brooks, Chase's style wasn't about performing with others. It was about waiting. Brooks once remarked to a casting director that Chase wasn't actually acting in a scene. He was simply waiting for everyone else to stop talking so he could remind them he was the smartest person in the room. In the Brooks philosophy of humor, comedy thrived on generosity. He wanted actors who could deliver a punchline and then gracefully hand the rhythm to someone else, allowing the entire ensemble to shine. Chevy Chase, however, didn't blend into an ensemble. He eclipsed it. This fundamental clash of styles came to a head during the casting of Spaceballs. Executives suggested Chase for the pivotal role of Dark Helmet, believing his deadpan delivery would be a perfect fit for the villainous parody. Brooks barely considered it, choosing instead Rick Moranis, a man he praised for knowing exactly when to step forward and, more importantly, when to step back. In private, Brooks described Chase as a performer who collided with comedy rather than moving with it. He felt that Chase's irony acted as a shield, preventing him from ever truly surrendering to the sincerity and commitment required for a scene to be genuinely funny. Their one significant meeting was a stiff, short encounter that lacked any hint of creative spark. Chase arrived with the swagger of a global superstar, while Brooks was searching for the musicality of a shared rhythm. When they parted, Brooks gave a faint, diplomatic smile and told Chase, "Maybe in another universe."
It was a polite way of saying that in Brooks's universe, there would never be room for an ego that refused to soften into the ensemble. Harvey Corman arrived in the world of Mel Brooks with a formidable pedigree as the gravitational center of The Carol Burnett Show. He was a performer who thrived in an environment of total looseness, where scripts shifted in the middle of a breath and characters were born from sudden, improvised impulses. To Corman, comedy was a living, breathing entity that could be bent to his will in the moment. But when he stepped onto a Mel Brooks set, he entered a different reality entirely. Brooks did not just direct his films, he composed them like a conductor overseeing a symphony, where every beat, every inflection, and every micropause was part of a meticulously tuned score. The most defining clash between these two creative forces erupted during the filming of High Anxiety. Brooks had cast Corman as Dr. Montague, the sinister yet absurd overseer of the Psychoneurotic Institute. The character was a vital component of the film's delicate balance of parody, but Corman could not resist the urge to drift off the score. He wanted to reinvent the role from the ground up, introducing brand new quirks and stretching scenes with improvised dialogue. Brooks, sensing his rhythm was being disrupted, shut the experimentation down instantly with a blunt reminder that the funny parts had already been written. They just needed Corman to perform them. From that point on, the atmosphere on set transformed into what crew members described as silent warfare. There were no dramatic screaming matches or public showdowns, but the tension lingered like a constant hum in the walls. Corman began to question basic blocking and re-examine every joke, while Brooks responded by trimming their professional interactions to the bare minimum. What should have been a celebration of comedic electricity became a delicate, diplomatic mission. Brooks even reached a point where he delivered instructions through intermediaries, while Corman spent his breaks in total isolation. On the screen, the friction was invisible. Corman was far too gifted to let the backstage strain corrupt his pitch-perfect performance. Audiences laughed at Dr. Montague without ever realizing the heavy price paid for those frames of film. However, Brooks remembered the struggle. After High Anxiety, Corman's name quietly vanished from Brooks's future casting lists. It wasn't born out of personal resentment, but rather from a sense of drained resolve. Brooks later acknowledged that while Corman brought brilliance, that brilliance came with a level of friction that disrupted the joy of the process. And for Brooks, joy was the very lifeblood of comedy. As Mel Brooks began the early development of Dracula Dead and Loving It, he was looking for a specific kind of whirlwind energy. The project was built on a foundation of visual comedy and gags flying like shrapnel, requiring a lead who could balance menace with full-blown buffoonery. Enter Frank Langella, a titan of the stage who had already mesmerized Broadway audiences with his definitive portrayal of the Count. On paper, Langella was the perfect Dracula, tall, elegant, and hypnotic. However, it was precisely this sophisticated, brooding nature
that made him a disastrous fit for the Brooks ecosystem. Brooks wasn't interested in a tortured immortal or a dark gothic romance. He wanted a Dracula who could seduce a room with perfect diction one moment and accidentally fling himself into a fireplace the next. From the very first rehearsals, the tonal collision was glaring. Langella arrived carrying the weight of Shakespearean thunder, treating every line as if it were part of a cathedral sermon. Brooks, the maestro of comedic frenzy, found himself tiptoeing around Langella's intense solemnity. Langella didn't volley jokes back or loosen his posture. He remained a knight at his post, unyielding in his commitment to gravitas. The production's rhythm began to wobble as the crew and cast wondered if they were filming a grand opera or a comedy. The breaking point arrived during a test read when Brooks handed Langella a setup designed to collapse from dramatic tension into slapstick gold. Langella paused, genuinely confused, and asked if Brooks wanted him to mock the text. After a long, silent stare, Brooks replied that he simply wanted him to survive it. By the end of the week, it was clear that Langella was performing in a different universe. The split happened quietly and with dignity, making way for Leslie Nielsen.
Nielsen possessed the rare ability to maintain a straight face while the world melted into chaos, providing the comedic anchor Brooks needed. He was a vampire who could slip on a rug and make it look like destiny, finally restoring the sacred rhythm that Langella's seriousness had nearly extinguished. The life of Mel Brooks at 99 is a testament to the idea that comedy is not merely about making people laugh, but about protecting a specific vision of the world. Throughout his century of life, Brooks has remained the ultimate gatekeeper of his own creative ecosystem. We have seen through his experiences with Jerry Lewis and Chevy Chase that even the highest level of celebrity power was not enough to bypass his requirement for humility and teamwork. He proved that a film set is not a place for a duel of egos, but a sanctuary for the ensemble. His reflections on Gene Wilder remind us that even the most beautiful artistic unions can be fragile, and that the pain of a professional parting can linger just as long as the joy of the collaboration itself. Meanwhile, his stories of Harvey Corman and Frank Langella highlight the technical demands of the Brooks rhythm. It was never enough to just be brilliant. An actor had to be in tune with the director's specific frequency. If the timing was off, or if the actor refused to surrender to the absurdity of the moment, the sacred energy of the comedy would simply evaporate. Ultimately, Brooks's legacy is defined by his refusal to compromise. He understood that the joy of the audience depends entirely on the joy and trust shared by the performers behind the camera. By naming those who disrupted that balance, he isn't being petty. He is explaining the laws of his universe. He is showing us that even at 99, he still holds the keys to the kingdom of laughter, and he knows exactly what it takes to keep the magic alive. What do you think about the names on this list? Was Mel Brooks right to protect his vision so fiercely? Or did the world miss out on legendary collaborations because of his rigid rules? We want to hear your thoughts on these Hollywood rifts, so please leave your comments in the section below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the memories of the stars, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from the golden age of cinema. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next chapter of history.